On the 6th of May 1953, a 20-year-old airman walked into a laboratory in Wiltshire and was told he'd be helping to find a cure for the common cold. Well, his name was Ronald Madison. He was the leading aircraftman in the Royal Air Force. He'd volunteered because the job paid an extra 15 shillings and he wanted to buy an engagement ring for his girlfriend. They sat him at a table. They rolled up his sleeve. They taped 2 layers of cloth to the skin of his forearm. The type of cloth that's battle dress uniforms are made of. And then a technician dripped a liquid onto the fabric and asked him to sit still. 20 drops, 200 milligrams of a clear, oily substance called GB. You know it by its other name, sarin. Within 20 minutes, Madison told the man next to him he felt unwell. Then he couldn't speak. He began to sweat through his uniform. He slid sideways off the chair. His body started to convulse, and a froth of fluid ran from the corners of his mouth, and by the time they got him onto a stretcher and into an ambulance, he was already dead. He was declared dead about an hour after the drops went on. 20 years old. The inquest into his death was held in secret. The verdict was recorded as misadventure. His family were told almost nothing. They were told not to ask. And that verdict stood sealed for 51 years until a second inquest in 2004 looked at the same evidence and called it what it was: unlawful killing. Here's the part that stays with me. Ronald Madison thought he was a volunteer. He signed a form. He'd been paid his 15 shillings. On paper, everything about that morning was consensual and above board. He just wasn't told the one thing that mattered, that the substance going onto his arm could kill him, and that the people applying it, well, they already knew that. This is the film about a specific kind of betrayal, not an enemy, not a stranger, but your own side, the government you serve, the uniform you wore, deciding that you were the most convenient thing in the room to be experimented on. We have a phrase for being shot by your own army. We call it friendly fire. There's no phrase for this one, so I'm going to borrow one. The friendly dose. 6 countries, 6 decades, tens of thousands of men who were told the same 3 things. That it was safe, that they'd volunteered, that it mattered, and who found out, most of them far too late, that at least 2 of those things were lies. We're going to go through them one by one at a time. And some of these things you might think that you know. I promise you, the real versions of them are often much, much worse, and a couple of these stories that you might have heard, including one about a soldier watching the bones glow inside his own hand, didn't happen quite where the internet says they did, but we'll get to that. Let's start in the Nevada desert, about 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas in the winter of 1951. The United States has just opened a place it calls the Nevada Proving Ground. It's a stretch of scrub and dry lake bed the size of a small country, and over the next 11 years, the Army is going to detonate around 100 nuclear weapons there. Above ground, out in the open air. And it's decided it doesn't just want to test the bombs, it wants to test the men. The program is called Exercise Desert Rock. The logic behind it is, in a cold way, almost reasonable, I guess. If there's going to be a nuclear war, and in 1951 an awful lot of serious people believe there is going to be a nuclear war, then American soldiers are going to have to fight on a battlefield where these things have been going off. So the Army, well, they need to know, what does a nuclear detonation do to a soldier, to a human being? Not to a building, not to a tank, but to a man. His nerves, his willingness to keep following orders when the sky has just caught fire. There's only one way to find that out. You put the man near the bomb, and then watch what he does. Over the course of Desert Rock, and the tests that followed it, somewhere in the region of 235,000 American servicemen take part in atmospheric nuclear testing.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
They come to be known later, when there's finally a word for them, as atomic veterans. Here's how a typical exercise went. Let's say you're an infantryman. You're told you're going on a training maneuver. The night before, they march you out to a position and you dig a trench and you sit in it and you wait. The trench is a set distance from the tower where the bomb sits. Sometimes it's a good deal closer, and at the appointed time, in the dark, a voice on a loudspeaker counts you down and tells you to crouch and close your eyes and cover them with your forearm. And then the bomb goes off. The men describe the same thing over and over across hundreds of interviews. The light comes first, and it comes through you. Eyes shut, arm across your face, and you can still see the bones of your own forearm, dark like a photographic negative, because the flash is bright enough to light you up from the inside. Well, then there's the heat on the back of the neck, like a door opening onto a furnace. And then a pause, and then the pressure wave arrives and slaps the trench. The dirt comes down on top of you, and some men said they felt it in their teeth, in their chest, a physical shove from something 2, 3, or even 4 miles away. And then, and this is the part that will get you, then they were ordered up out of the trench and they marched forward toward it, toward the stem of the mushroom cloud, across ground that was still warm, to conduct maneuvers at the site of a nuclear explosion that had gone off just minutes ago. Now, the soldiers had film badges, little dosimeter badges that clipped to their uniform. They were supposed to record how much radiation that they had absorbed, so somebody, somewhere, could keep you safe. Well, a lot of those badges, they didn't work. Some were duds out of the factory, some got wet or lost or were collected and never properly read. And then there's a persistent documented problem across the whole program, which is that when the readings were inconvenient, when a man's badge came back showing a dose that was too high, the number that ended up in the file was something lower than the number on the badge. The badge, it turns out, wasn't really there to protect the soldier, it was there to generate data. The soldiers were the experiment. The badge was just the clipboard. And hold that image as we move on. The badge is the clipboard. It's going to come back up in every country we visit tonight. Different flag, same little device, doing the same quiet job. But let's be specific, because specific is where this stops being a statistic. Operation Plum Bob, summer of 1957, the largest, longest series of tests ever conducted at the Nevada site. 29 detonations across about 5 months. One shot in that series was codenamed Smokey. Roughly 3,000 soldiers took part in the Smokey exercise. And decades later, when researchers finally went looking, they found something they couldn't explain away. Among the men who were at Smokey, the rate of leukemia came back significantly higher than you'd expect for a group of otherwise healthy young men that size. It's not a rumor, it's not veterans' hunch, a finding in medical literature that the Center for Disease Control took seriously enough to study. Think about the position that puts a man in. He was on a training exercise in 1957. He's told it was routine. He goes home, gets on with his life, and 20 years later he's got leukemia, and there is a scientific paper with his exercise's name on it explaining why. There was one more group at Plum Bob I want to mention, because they almost never get named. During a shot called Priscilla and others, the army wasn't only studying infantry in trenches. There were pigs. Hundreds and hundreds of pigs, dressed in specially made military uniforms and body armor, tethered at measured distances from the blast to see how the fabric and the armor held up against the thermal flash, because pig skin is a decent stand-in for human skin. I mention the pigs not for shock. I mention them because of what they tell you about the frame of mind. Somebody sat in an office and thought carefully about how to protect the uniform. The men wearing the same uniform a few hundred yards back, further away in the trench, nobody was running that calculation for them. It took until 1990 for the United States to formally admit it owed these men anything. That year, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA. It set up a fund. If you were an on-site participant at the tests, or a civilian living downwind who developed one of a specific list of cancers, you could file and receive a lump sum. $75,000 for the on-site men. $75,000 for standing in a trench 2 miles from a nuclear weapon and then walking towards it. And here is the thing about that money. It arrived for a lot of these men at their funerals. The average atomic veteran was in his 60s or 70s by the time the check came. Some of the families filed the paperwork on behalf of a man who was already dead. And if you think a soldier being asked to face a nuclear weapon with his eyes shut and his own hand over his face is as close as this gets, then hold on. Because the story you've probably heard, one about the bones in the hand, it's real. It just belongs to a different ocean and a different flag, and that is next. There's a story that goes around about the atomic tests, and you've probably all seen it. A young soldier is ordered to turn his back on the blast and cover his eyes, and in the flash he sees the bones of his own hand lit up through the skin like an X-ray. It's one of those details that sounds a little bit too good to be true. It's too cinematic. And I'll be honest with you, when I first started pulling this film together, I found that anecdote attached to American soldiers in Nevada, and I nearly used it there. Because it is real, men did see this, but the best documented version, the one with names and dates and a place you can point to on a map, didn't happen in Nevada. It happened here, on a British possession in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the men it happened to were ours. By the mid-1950s, Britain is desperate to join the hydrogen bomb club. All the cool kids are getting in. Americans have got the H-bomb, the Soviets have got the H-bomb. Britain, the country that helped invent the whole field, is being left behind, and the government decides that needs to change, and it needs to change fast, regardless of whatever it takes. The program is called Operation Grapple. The place they choose to do it is Christmas Island, Kiritimati, a remote coral atoll near the equator, and they ship out around 22,000 British servicemen to make it happen. We're talking sailors, airmen, army engineers. A lot of them are teenagers on national service. Boys, basically, who a year earlier were working in a garage or a bank in England. Let me give you one of them because I want to name a name in your head and not just a number. Ron Watson. He was from Cambridgeshire. He was 17 years old when he finished his training out with the Royal Engineers. He was shipped off on Boxing Day and dropped onto a tropical island he'd never heard of. And on the 28th of April 1958, he witnessed a test the British called Grapple Y. Grapple Y was and remains the largest nuclear weapon the United Kingdom has ever detonated. It was around 3 megatons. To give you a sense of that, it's more than 100 times the size of the bomb that flattened Nagasaki. Here's what the men were told to do. Sit on the beach, or stand on the deck of a ship with your back to the blast. It's alright, boys. Just keep your eyes closed, you'll be fine. Put your hands over your closed eyes. There's no goggles, no protective gear. For most of them, no shirt. They're in shorts and sandals in the tropical heat. And just stand there, wait for the flash. Ron Watson described it like this. Back to the explosion, eyes shut, hand over his face, and he said, quote, "I could clearly see the bones in my hand, just like you see them if you look at the results of an X-ray." Now you can understand where the story comes from, and you understand that the men aren't exaggerating. That is genuinely what a multi-megaton thermonuclear flash does. It is bright enough that a human hand pressed over closed human eyes becomes translucent. That's not folklore, that's just physics, and it happened to teenagers from Cambridgeshire. There's a second man I want to put next to Ron Watson. In the record, he's referred to as William. Now, his son took the story to a member of parliament, and it ended up being read into the official record of the House of Commons, which is the only reason we can be sure of it. William was below deck on his ship when they were ordered up top. He came up in shorts and sandals. The crew were told that they were about to see something that nobody had ever seen, and to cover their eyes with their hands until the flash had passed. The ship was about 20 miles from the detonation, and William, like Ron Watson, saw the bones in his hand lit up in complete clarity, as if under an X-ray, and then watched the cloud climb into the sky and hang there. His son said years later that the cloud haunted his father for the rest of his life. So that is the image, sourced, nailed down, real, but it is still nowhere near the worst thing in this act, not by a distance. The worst thing is a document, because before Grapple Y went off, the senior medical officer of the whole task force sat down and wrote a draft report about what he expected to happen to the men. His name was Air Commodore Dennis Wilson, and in that report, ahead of the test, he wrote that in the event the bomb performed as expected, there would, quote, almost certainly be, in addition to considerable material damage, casualties to individuals, and that this should be taken into consideration. So let's read that again the way I had to. The man, whose entire job was the health of those servicemen, wrote down before the test that some of them would become casualties. He recommended this be taken into consideration, and then the test went ahead anyway, with the men on the beach in their shorts, hands over their eyes. The casualties weren't an accident. They were a line item. Somebody considered them, exactly as recommended, and then pressed on. Then there's what came after. Grapple Y detonated lower than it should have, in the wet season, and a radioactive black rain fell back down onto the island, onto the ships, onto the men, and onto the indigenous islanders who lived there, some of whom had been moved by the Defense Ministry, some of whom simply hadn't. And the aftermath for the veterans is its own scandal. The British nuclear test veterans have spent the better part of 60 years asking their own government to admit they were harmed. Descendants report elevated rates of birth defects and childhood cancers. New Zealand research on veterans found genetic damage, and Britain, the country that agreed to pay Australia £20 million over contamination, as we'll see, has fought its own veterans in court, denying liability decade after decade. The men are dying off now, and there aren't many of them left. And a lot of them went to their graves as, officially, according to their own government, men to whom nothing was done. Britain, though, had been in this game a long time before Christmas Island, long before the H-bomb, because 15 years earlier, on a little green island off the Scottish coast, the same country had already run an experiment so successful and so dangerous that the whole island stayed sealed off from the human race for the next half a century, and almost everything you've heard about who died there is almost completely wrong. So off the northwest coast of Scotland is a wide sea loch. There's a small uninhabited island, green, low, unremarkable. It's about a mile long. From the mainland road, you'd drive past it without a second look. For 48 years, there were signs on it warning you to stay away, in several languages, because the ground itself would kill you. 1942, Britain's at war, and losing and frightened, and a very serious question is being asked at the highest levels of the war effort. Can you attack a country with a disease? Could you build a biological weapon, deploy it, and make an enemy's land uninhabitable? The agent they settled on was anthrax, specifically a strain logged as Volum 1457-8. Anthrax is close to ideal for this, in the most horrible possible way, because it forms spores, tiny, armoured, dormant seeds of bacterium that can sit in soil, alive and lethal for decades. Inhale enough of them, and you are almost certainly dead, and there is no cure worth the name in 1942. The plan on the books was genuinely apocalyptic. It was called Operation Vegetarian, and the idea was to drop millions of linseed cattle cakes laced with anthrax spores onto the fields of Germany. The idea being that the cattle eat the cakes, the cattle die, the food supply collapses, and anthrax works its way into the German population. They actually manufactured the cakes, 5 million of them. But before you deploy something like that, you have to know how it works. You have to test it. And you can't test an anthrax bomb in Wiltshire. You need somewhere isolated, somewhere you can afford to lose. They chose Grunard. Now, here's where I have to stop and correct something, because this story has been told wrong so many times that the wrong version has almost replaced the truth, and a version of it made it into the first draft of this very video script before I checked it. The way you'll often hear it, British servicemen were taken to Grunard, positioned downwind, and made to breathe anthrax to see what it would do to them, and that one of them subsequently died. Well, that's not what happened. I want to be precise, because precision is the whole point of this channel. The subjects on the island were sheep. Around 60 of them. Makes the name Operation Vegetarian kind of funny. And they were tethered in rows across the ground at measured distances. The scientists from Porton Down, in protective suits and respirators, detonated small anthrax bombs upwind, and the spore cloud drifted across the tethered animals, and within days the sheep began to die. All of them. Every exposed animal dead of inhalation anthrax, exactly as designed. There is no credible record of a serviceman being deliberately gassed with anthrax on Grunard, and no documented human death from the trials themselves. If you've read otherwise, and it's still all over the internet, you've read a story that grew in the telling. The men on that island were all in suits. The ones dying were the sheep. And I'm labouring this because it matters. The true story doesn't need any embellishment. What actually happened on Grunard is more than bad enough. What actually happened is that the experiment worked far, far better than anyone wanted or expected. The spores didn't drift away. They didn't die off. They sank into the soil and stayed there, alive and lethal and waiting, and the island, 1 whole square mile of Scotland, became so contaminated that the government just sealed it off completely. So for 48 years, Grunard Island was quarantined. No one was allowed to land. Warning signs were all over the shore. An entire piece of British soil turned into a no-go zone by its own government's experiments and left that way for nearly half a century. In the early 1980s, a group calling itself the Dark Harvest Commandos got fed up with waiting. They landed on the island, dug up a bucket of the contaminated soil, and left it at the gates of the Porton Down Research Centre, and another sample in the town where the ruling party was holding its conference. It's a pointed way of asking if it's so safe, you wouldn't mind having a look at it, would you? Well, it worked. The pressure built, and finally in 1986, the government did the decontamination that it had avoided for decades, soaking the whole island in a solution of formaldehyde and seawater and tearing out the worst of the topsoil. In 1990, they drove a flock of sheep onto the island, waited, and when the sheep stayed alive, they declared Grunard safe, 48 years after they had poisoned it. I brought you to Scotland for a reason, and it isn't really the island. It's what Grunard tells you about the people running these programs. Because those same people, at that same place, Porton Down, they didn't stop at sheep. Remember Ronald Madison from the very start of this film? The airman with the 15 shillings and the engagement ring, dead of sarin on a laboratory table in 1953. That was Porton Down too. Same institution, and Madison was not a one-off. Over several decades, more than 20,000 British servicemen passed through Porton Down as test subjects for chemical and nerve agents. Many were told, like Madison, that they were helping the research into the common cold, or they were helping with research into the common cold, which is why they volunteered. And they were paid a few shillings and given a bit of extra leave, and a great number of them had no real idea what was being put on their skin or into the air they breathed. It took until 2008, 55 years after Madison died, for the Ministry of Defence to pay compensation to a group of these veterans and to express carefully its regrets. £3 million shared out, which works out per man at rather less than the country spent finding out what nerve gas does to them. Well, Britain, they used their own soldiers as subjects at home, quietly, in a lab. But, I mean, if you wanted to do it out in the open with thousands of men, let's say in the desert, with the whole thing dressed up as national glory, well, then you do what the France did and go to Sahara. February 1960. The Algerian Sahara, a part of the world so flat and so empty that when the sun comes up, there's nothing to stop it. No hills, no trees, no shade for 100 miles. France is late to the nuclear party and they are furious about it. The Americans, the Soviets and the British, they all have the bomb. France, under de Gaulle, sees a seat at the top table slipping away and decides to build its own, fast, out here in a colony where nobody important will be watching. On the 13th of February 1960, they detonate it. They call it Gaboy Bleu, Blue Jerboa. The Jerboa being the desert rodent and the blue because the first colour of the French flag is blue. It's about 70 kilotons, 3 to 4 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb, in a single go. First try. Good effort, lads, well done. As a piece of engineering, it is a triumph, and France celebrates it as one. Then comes the others. Gaboy Blanche, white, Gaboy Rouge, red, and Gaboy Vert, green. The last of the 4 rushed out in April 1961 in a hurry for a reason that you almost couldn't make up. You see, there was a military coup underway in Algeria. Generals had turned against de Gaulle, and Paris was so worried the rebels might seize a functioning atom bomb, they decided to detonate it early, partly just to destroy it and to burn the device out before the wrong Frenchman could grab it. A nuclear test conducted in part to keep the weapon out of the hands of your own army, who might be trying to be not your own army anymore. So, where are the men? This is where France earns its place in this film. The French didn't just have observers at safe distance. French conscripts, young men doing compulsory military service, so not volunteers in any way, shape or sense at all, were positioned near ground zero. And in some of the exercises, the whole point was to march them toward it afterwards, exactly as the Americans did in Nevada, to study how troops would function on a nuclear battlefield. Veterans have been described being told to, or made to, stand or to lie face down in the sand, wearing shorts and short-sleeved shirts, sometimes with nothing over their eyes, and then get up after the flash and advance towards the crater to take measurements. Men remember being at or near the point zero itself in the hours after the detonation, with equipment that was barely adequate and orders that were absolute. And then there is Eka. When the atmospheric tests ended, France moved to underground testing in tunnels bored into a mountain in the Hogar, at a site called Eka. And on the first day of May 1962, a test codenamed Beryl went a bit wrong. The mountain didn't hold. The tunnel wasn't sealed properly, and when the bomb went off, a jet of superheated radioactive lava and gas blew straight back out of the tunnel mouth and into the open air, in front of an audience that included French government ministers. 2 of them standing there watching as a radioactive cloud rolled toward them and everyone ran for the cars. Soldiers were sent in afterwards to deal with the site. Their exposure, like everyone in this film, was recorded lightly or not at all. It took France until 2010 to pass a compensation law, the Morin Law, for the veterans and civilians of these tests. And when the declassified French documents finally started coming out in 2013, they showed what by now you'll expect them to show. That the fallout had spread wider than the government ever admitted, across the desert, all over towns, onto the Algerians who lived there and were told nothing at all, and who are to this day largely uncompensated. We are 4 countries in, and you might have noticed that there's a pattern here. The desert, the trench, the badge that doesn't work, the apology that arrives 50 years too late. Our 5th story has all of that, and then it does something the others didn't quite dare. It doesn't just use the soldiers, it uses the people who are already living on the land, and it lies to them in the language of their own god. The name Marilinga was borrowed from an Aboriginal language. It means thunder. Somebody in the British government thought that was fitting. In hindsight, it's the single most tasteless thing about the entire operation, and there is a lot of competition. Here's the arrangement. Britain wanted a permanent site to test nuclear weapons, and its own island was too small and too crowded. Well, Australia, those guys had a vast, dry interior that Canberra regarded as empty. The Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, agreed to hand it over to the British, and he did, according to the record, without consulting his own cabinet. The land wasn't empty, of course, it belonged to the Aborigines. People who had lived on it for something in the order of tens of thousands of years. Between 1956 and 63, the British detonated 7 major nuclear devices at Marilinga. But it's not the big bombs that did the lasting damage. It's what they called the minor trials, around 550 of them. Experiments on bomb components that didn't produce a nuclear explosion, but that burnt and scattered plutonium across the desert. The minor trials alone spread something like 22 kilograms of plutonium across the site. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. Which means, in plain terms, that the contamination those experiments left in the South Australian desert will still be dangerous long after every language now spoken on Earth has been forgotten. Now, the servicemen. British and Australian troops were stationed here in their thousands, and they got the familiar treatment. Shorts, shirts, and hats. Some were ordered to stand with their backs to the blast and press the heel of their palms to their eye sockets. Some pilots were sent up to fly through the mushroom cloud, deliberately, to collect samples. Their radiation exposure, as a rule, was monitored badly or not at all. And this is the point where I have to correct the record again, because it matters, and because getting it wrong actually hands ammunition to the people who'd rather none of this were discussed. You'll see it said, a lot, that 30% of Marilinga servicemen died of cancer. It's an arresting number, and I understand why it spreads, but it isn't what the actual research shows, and I am not going to repeat it as though it were. The proper study is the one the Australian Department of Veterans Affairs Commission then published in 2006, covering more than 16,000 Australian test participants. What it found was this. The participants had cancer rates about 23% higher than the general population and died of cancer at a rate about 18% higher. 23% higher, not 30% total. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole reason this channel exists. But I'll give you the honest complication too, because the same study includes it. The researchers could not prove the extra cancers were caused by radiation. The men also smoked more than average and differed from the general population in other ways. The elevated cancer is real and documented, but the direct causal line back to the bomb is scientifically not nailed shut. That's less satisfying than 30% died of cancer, it's also true. And the true version is still a government exposing thousands of its men to radiation, monitoring them barely and leaving them decades later measurably sicker than the people they'd served. But the servicemen, in the end, are not the worst of Marilinga. The worst of it is what was done to the people who were already there. The Aborigines were supposed to be cleared from the test area. The job of clearing an area the size of England fell for long stretches to essentially one man, a native patrol officer named Walter McDougall, who understood perfectly well that the task he'd been given was impossible, and he said so. So people were missed. There were documented cases of Aboriginal families camping in the test area, sheltering in a bomb crater because it was a hollow out of the wind, walking across contaminated ground with bare feet, breathing the dust. One family, the Milpudi family, was found by servicemen camped near a contaminated site and had to be scrubbed down and checked. Their dogs were shot. And to keep people away from the danger, the authorities reached for something genuinely dark. They didn't explain radiation. How would or could you across a language barrier in the 1950s? Instead, in places, the story put about was that the land was home of a mamu, a dangerous spirit, and later the noise and the strange sickness were folded into that. The invisible thing that would hurt you if you went to the wrong place was explained as an evil spirit, which in a sense that the men in suits would never have admitted was kind of completely accurate. A young Aboriginal man called Yami Lester was living with his community when a test cloud from the earlier tests at Emu Field rolled across their camp. He described a strange black mist moving through the scrub. Not long after, he went blind. He spent the rest of his life as one of the great voices demanding Australia face what it had been done. And he was one of the reasons the Royal Commission happened at all. The reckoning, when it came, was the McKelland Royal Commission of the mid-1980s, which tore into both the British and the Australian authorities for their treatment of the servicemen and to the Aboriginals. A first half-hearted clean-up in the 60s had been found woefully inadequate. A proper one was finally completed in 2000 at a cost of 108 million Australian dollars. In 2009, most of the land was handed back to its people and declared safe to walk, camp and hunt on. Most of the land, Britain paid Australia £20 million towards the cleanup, which is, you'll remember, the very same government that has spent decades refusing to admit it owned its own Christmas Island veterans anything. It'll pay to clean the dirt, but it won't clean to pay the men who stood in it. 5 countries, and every single one of them a democracy, a country that would tell you sincerely that it operates under the rule of law and the consent of the governed. So let me take you finally somewhere that made no such claim, somewhere that did all of this on a scale the others never reached, to more men at once than any of them, and then buried it so deep it stayed secret until the country that did it no longer existed. In September 2022, standing in front of the Russian parliament, Vladimir Putin said something that most of the room took as a simple statement of fact. He said the United States was the only country in the world ever to have used nuclear weapons. It's a good line. It's also not true. And the reason it's not true is a place called Totskoya, and the day in 1954 that the Soviet Union spent 40 years pretending never happened. So here's the setup. By 1954, the Soviets have the bomb, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who took Berlin, the most famous soldier in the USSR, wants to know the same thing the Americans want to know. Can an army fight through a nuclear battlefield? Can you drop an atom bomb on a defensive line and then send your own troops charging through the gap while the dust is still settling? There's only one way to find out. And Zhukov, unlike his Western counterparts, is not going to mess about with a few thousand men in trenches. He assembles 45,000 of them. They pick a stretch of the South Urals, chosen specifically because the landscape resembles Western Europe, because that's where they expect to fight the Third World War. They spend 3 months building a fake battlefield, trenches, bunkers, pillboxes. They scatter old tanks around to see what the blast does to them. And they bring in 45,000 soldiers and tell them, most of them, nothing. The men are sworn to secrecy, a 25-year secrecy oath. Some of them a lifetime one. They're told there'll be an exercise involving a new weapon. Most of the ordinary soldiers don't learn what that weapon is until the morning of the test. At 9:33 in the morning on the 14th of September, a Tupolev bomber drops a 40-kiloton bomb 2 to 3 times Hiroshima, and the airburst is about 350 meters over the range. The men are in trenches. They got gas masks with darkened glass, and that's more or less it. One of them, a soldier named Vasily Kovalov, described a light through that darkened glass years later. He fought in the Second World War. He'd seen artillery, he had seen shells, he had seen everything the ordinary war could throw at a man. And he said this flash was something else entirely, a beam of light stronger than an electric welding arc, coming through smoked glass built to let you look at the sun. Then the order came to break cover, climb out of the trenches, board trucks and advance. Another veteran, Ivan Skvortskov, remembered coming up out of the ground and seeing the mushroom cloud rising ahead of him. the direction they were being told to march. Around 3 hours after the detonation, roughly 40,000 men moved forward through the blast zone with tanks to stage a mock battle across ground where a nuclear weapon had just gone off. And then they went home and were forgotten and forbidden on pain of prison and death camps and gulags from telling anyone, including their own doctors, where they had been or what they had done. The last detail is the cruelest, and it's the one that made Totskoya almost impossible to study, because the men couldn't tell their doctors. When a Totskoya veteran got sick years later and went to a hospital, his own service records had been scrubbed. They had been altered to hide where he'd been. The archives of the local regional hospitals covering the years that would have shown the health effects, 1954 all the way through to 1980, were gone, destroyed. So they will never have the clean number. We can tell you what percentage of the 45,000 died of what. The Soviet state made sure of that on purpose by burning the paper. The secrecy wasn't just to protect the test, it was retroactive. It reached forward in time to make sure the consequences were also unmeasurable. Civilians got it too. There were villages a few kilometers away. A strong wind that morning carried the radioactive cloud far beyond the range, by some accounts hundreds of kilometers. The people underneath it were told the flash and the noise were an ordinary military exercise and left where they were. Totskoya stayed secret until the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. Nearly 40 years. And it only surfaced then because there was no longer a state with the power to keep the lid on it. The men who were still alive were finally allowed to say where they had been. So when Vladimir Putin tells a parliament that only one country ever used a nuclear weapon on people, remember Totskoya. His own country did it too, to its own soldiers, on purpose, and then spent 4 decades making sure no one could prove it. 6 countries. I want to close by putting them next to each other because separately they look like 6 accidents and together they look like something else. The United States told its soldiers a trench 2 miles from a nuclear weapon was a training exercise. Britain told its teenagers on a Pacific beach to cover their eyes with their hands, having already written down that some of them would be casualties. It told other men in a lab that nerve gas was research into a cold cure. France put its conscripts in shorts in the desert and marched them towards the crater. Australia and Britain together poisoned a stretch of country older than history and then lied to the people in it in a language of spirits. And the Soviet Union did all of it at once to 45,000 men and then burned the hospital records so that the dying couldn't be counted. Every one of them said the same 3 things. It's safe. You volunteered. It matters. It usually wasn't safe. They mostly hadn't volunteered. Not really. Not with the truth in front of them. And whether it mattered, whether any of the data was worth a single one of these men, is a question the people who ran these programs made very sure they'd never have to answer in a courtroom, because by the time anyone came asking, the files were thin, the badges were lost, and the men were old or gone. The film badge is the thing I kept coming back to. That little square clipped to the chest of a frightened young man in Nevada, the Sahara, and the South Urals alike. He thought it was there to look after him. It was there to take a reading. He wasn't the person being protected. He was the instrument being used. There's a compensation check waiting at the end of most of these stories. $75,000, £3 million shared out, $20 million to clean the dirt. And in almost every case, the money came decades late, in amounts that would cover the funerals maybe, to men who by then wanted an admission far more than they wanted a payment. Ronald Madison wanted to buy an engagement ring. He was 20 years old and he volunteered for the 15 shillings and they dripped sarin onto his arm and watched him die. And then they told his family to be quiet for 51 years. That's the friendly dose. It's not the enemy, your own side. Deciding you were the cheapest way to find something out.